Moscow. The late 1950s. A high-ranking Western diplomat enters the apartment of a woman with whom he has already begun an affair. Everything seems almost ordinary. A closed door, a few minutes away from official protocol. Then the door suddenly opens. The husband comes home. A scandal, threats, fear of public humiliation. The diplomat leaves, shaken, and seeks help from an influential Soviet acquaintance. The man promises to make the problem disappear. But every person in this scene is already exactly where they are supposed to be. The woman, the husband, the acquaintance who will offer salvation, the people watching from the shadows. It is at this moment that an affair stops being private life and becomes a state operation. That diplomat was Maurice de Jean, the French ambassador in Moscow. His story is one of the best-known documented examples of what intelligence agencies call a honey trap. An intimate relationship is created or exploited in order to obtain secrets, influence, or material for blackmail. The United States Central Intelligence Agency explicitly lists seduction, followed by compromising exposure, among genuine intelligence methods. CIA. But it is important to strip away the cinematic fog. The Committee for State Security really did use sexual compromise. Yet intelligence historians emphasize that espionage was far more often built on money, ideology, resentment, access to secrets, or voluntary offers of cooperation. The honey trap was not a magical key. It was one tool among many, especially powerful when a person feared exposure more than the act itself. CIA. If stories matter to you, where Secret Service legends are tested against documents, real names, and real human consequences, leave a like on this video and subscribe. Here, it matters to separate history from seductive myths. The Committee for State Security received that name in 1954. For foreigners living in Moscow, what appeared to be a chance encounter was not always accidental at all. CIA. Maurice de Jean was an experienced French diplomat and a man close to Charles de Gaulle. Soviet counterintelligence studied his weakness for women and constructed a long operation around it. Introductions, trust, romance, and finally the staged appearance of a husband who suddenly arrives and threatens a scandal. PBS. But more important than the sex itself was who appeared afterward. De Jean turned to a Soviet acquaintance for help. That man, however, was part of the same operation. The security service first created the problem and then offered the solution. Targets were not necessarily told immediately. Now you work for us. It was far more effective to make a person feel that his reputation, marriage, and career now depended on the very people who appeared to have saved him from disaster. PBS. In material from Vasily Mitrokhin's archive, later studied by historian Christopher Andrew, the operation against de Jean is linked to the leadership of the KGB's second chief directorate and to Oleg Gribanov. But the famous trap did not produce the flawless result that a spy novel might suggest. The operation was exposed after Yuri Krotkov, a Soviet writer connected to the scheme, defected to the West. Yumpu. One man stepped outside the system, and a years-long operation began to collapse. But in another case, the same mechanism worked with far more frightening consequences. John Vassall was an employee of the British Embassy in Moscow, not a minister, not a general, a civil servant with access to documents, and one dangerous secret for that era. He was a gay man, at a time when sexual relations between men were criminalized both in Britain and in the Soviet Union. The British National Archives explicitly describes Vassall as a man who fell into a KGB trap and was then subjected to blackmail. The National Archives. He was invited to a party. There was alcohol, there were men, and there was the feeling of being in a closed space where, for once, he did not have to pretend. Then the compromising photographs appeared. The trap did not close, because he loved someone he should not have loved. It closed because the laws and social norms of the time had turned the very fact of his private life into a weapon. Vassal began passing secret material to the Soviet Union. After returning to Britain, he continued to have access to naval information. In 1962, he was arrested, and the case became one of the most notorious British espionage scandals of the Cold War. Historians debate how far he remained a victim of the original blackmail and how far, over time, he became a willing participant in the relationship with Soviet intelligence. But the mechanism of compromise itself is documented. We've reached the halfway point of this story, and if you can already see how different the reality was from the legend of the beautiful female spy, tell me in the comments, what is more frightening? The seduction itself, or the moment when a person is shown that his secret now belongs to the state? And support the video with a like. The Vassal case reveals something else as well. A honey trap did not necessarily mean a woman targeting a man. Modern research into Cold War history shows that Soviet security organs also exploited same-sex relationships, while the criminal prosecution of gay men inside the Soviet Union made fear of exposure an especially powerful instrument. Intelligence did not exploit only a person's desire. It exploited the laws, shame, and social isolation surrounding that desire. In 1968, the danger reached the very top of British diplomacy. Sir Geoffrey Harrison, Britain's ambassador in Moscow, entered into a sexual relationship with a Soviet woman working at the residence. The story later became known as a KGB operation. Harrison confessed to his superiors and was recalled, and by doing so, he destroyed the main source of leverage. The secret was no longer a secret. That may be the central principle behind this entire story. Compromising material is only as powerful as a person's belief that exposure will destroy him. That is why the real target was not necessarily love. Sometimes infidelity was enough. Sometimes it was a relationship condemned by society. Sometimes loneliness. Sometimes the desire to feel important. Late in the Cold War, a similar human vulnerability appeared in the case of U.S. Marine Clayton Lonetree, who served as a security guard at the American Embassy in Moscow. A review published by the Central Intelligence Agency notes that his lover turned out to have connections to the KGB. Lonetree was later convicted of espionage. At the same time, some of the earliest sensational claims about how deeply he had supposedly opened the American Embassy to Soviet intelligence were later called into question. And this is why the image of the Soviet swallow can be misleading. The woman used in such an operation was not always a professional intelligence officer. Sources describe both specially recruited civilians and people pressured or persuaded into cooperation. In intelligence slang, women used for sexual compromise were often called swallows. But turning this into a legend about some single academy of irresistible femme fatales would be far too simple. Behind the operation stood the study of a target's habits, surveillance, control of the environment, sometimes covert photography, and intelligence officers deciding exactly when pressure was most likely to work. CIA. In other words, beauty was not the main weapon. The real weapon was knowing what a person was most afraid of losing. A career, a family, freedom, a name. And this is where the history of intelligence services stops being entertainment. For the history of Soviet Jews, this mechanism of state control also has a familiar sound, although it would be wrong to claim that Jewish refuseniks were systematically recruited through sexual traps. A different layer of pressure is well documented. Surveillance, interrogation, accusations of disloyalty, and suspicions surrounding contacts with foreigners. Natan Sharansky, after campaigning for the right to leave for Israel, came under intense surveillance. In 1977, the Soviet press falsely accused him of espionage. Soon afterward, he was arrested. The method was different, but the principle was similar. The state attempted to transform a person's private relationships into political evidence. If there are 4 things worth remembering from this story, they are these. The Committee for State Security really did use sexual compromise. It could involve both women and men. Its power came not from seduction itself, but from the fear of exposure. And finally, honey traps were real. But they do not explain the whole history of Soviet espionage. Many agents approached intelligence services themselves because of money, ideology, or other motives. 3. There might have been only 2 people in the room, but the operation almost never involved only 2 people. Beyond the door, there was already an entire world of surveillance, files, photographs, pre-arranged meetings, and people who knew exactly when to appear and what to offer. And that is why the most disturbing part of this story is not the sex. It is not even the infidelity. It is the moment when a person's private weakness stops belonging to that person alone. If you watched all the way to the end, write the code word "compromat" in the comments. That will tell me you saw the entire story. Subscribe if you believe it is important to remember not only the great events of history, but also the mechanisms by which a state could make people afraid of their own private lives.